Good morning and welcome to our presentation on genes and social determinants of drug addictions and the impact on African and Latinx Americans, presented for the Multi-Advocates for Cultural Competence. My name is Dr. Alvin Pelt, and I am pleased to be able to share with you some information on this topic this morning. The goal would be to educate the audience on how environmental stressors affect us through alterations of our DNA and our genes, and how that makes us and our children more susceptible to chronic diseases like opiate addictions. I'd also like to introduce the audience to three terms that are part of the conversation for the causes of drug addictions and the treatment of drug addictions. And that would include threat stress. The other concept is telomeres, Telomeres, and the concept of mindfulness. We will discuss each one in detail, and in particular how they affect a person that is vulnerable to a high stress environment. The objectives for today's session is to, again, educate the audience, in particular, on the basic mechanisms of genetic transmission of disease, and to be able to identify three negative environmental factors that increase the risks of opiate addiction in the African American and Latinx American populations. And thirdly, once we understand the risk that is inherent in these high stress, high threat environments, what can we do to buffer the negative environmental factors through lifestyle changes, things that we can control? So let's start the discussion today with the question, what are drug addictions? Well, in their simplest forms, they're chronic diseases that are primarily affect the brain. And we will see that it has a genetic component as well. But in terms of opiate addictions and all addictions, the brain is the target organ. It's the organ where the disease manifests its form or its effect on the person. So the brain is the control center for our mental and physical activities. So when the brain suffers from an addiction, quite obviously, you will see changes in the mental and physical health of the individual. That is how drug addictions manifest themselves as chronic diseases. And the next question is, how do addictions affect the brain? What does it do in particular? Well, once the addiction affects the brain, you lose control. There's a loss of self-control, and the addictions hijack the brain's pleasure center and the decision-making center. So there is a flip from going from rational decision-making to ultimate pleasure decisions. So it causes a lot of havoc in a person's life. Next, let's talk about drug control. After the drug fully takes control of brain functioning, you start to see irrational decisions and crazy behaviors that makes no sense. And for the uninformed, for the general public, when you have a family member with a drug addiction, and the drug has taken control of their brain, it has hijacked their brain's decision-making operations and hijacked the pleasure center, you see behaviors that you can't explain. You may have a person that was previously raised in a good home environment. They may have been a responsible, high achieving person heading to great things in life, and all of a sudden they plateau. They're not achieving anymore, and even worse, they start to lose ground. And you see the difficult behaviors that seems crazy and makes no sense. So next, I'd like to talk somewhat about what determines whether a person gets a drug addiction. I think many of us have had the experience of knowing someone or even personally where there may have been some drugs used in one point in life, but we were able to pick it up and put it down and move forward. It was just a phase of life that we went through. It did not become a permanent activity. So we may know of people who have done drugs before, but were able to put it down and move forward. However, there are people that start using drugs and it throws them way off. They're not able to complete their goals. They're not able to finish school. They're not able to attain high levels of employment because the drug use has taken over. And the three main areas that determines whether one becomes addicted to a drug is number one is your genes. You can thank your mom and dad or your grandparents or your ancestors because genetic exposure, genetic vulnerability, or genetic predisposition is a big part, which we'll see shortly. The second is exposure. So I can have a really high genetic probability, meaning that my mom or dad were addicted to drugs, or I have a first-degree relative, a brother or sister addicted to drugs, or I may have had a grandparent who was alcohol or drug addicted. But if I never pick up that drug, or I never pick up that drink, then essentially my brain has had no exposure. So it lowers my risk of becoming addicted because I never had exposure. And the third element is the environment, which is a major part of my talk today, is looking at how the environment can increase your risk of becoming addicted to a drug, and how it can alter your genes, which is a very interesting topic that needs wider exposure. So let's look at these three elements in detail. Drug addictions are caused or triggered by these three factors. And number one is genetic. According to Dr. Noah Volkow, who is the head of the National Institute on Drug Addiction and is certainly one of my hero mentors, somewhat removed. I don't know her personally. But she is certainly a leader in my field of addiction. And she says that about 50 up to 60% of the reasons on why a person becomes addicted to a drug is their genes, what we call genetic predisposition, and where that gene is passed along to you by your parents or your grandparents. But sometimes genes, they have a funny response. They may not transmit straight through to each generation. Sometimes they may skip over a generation. So if your grandparents had an addiction to alcohol or drugs, it may have bypassed your parents. That gene may have skipped over your parents, and so they may not have had an addiction, but by the time you come along, that gene may turn up in your DNA. And so you may be vulnerable to the addiction, even though your mom and dad were not. The second thing I like to talk about is exposure. And so if you remember earlier when I said the main reason for a drug addiction is a disease of the brain. So if you expose your brain cells to drugs or alcohol, it's a chance you can become addicted. But in humans, it depends on a certain stage. All animal models, their brains have the ability to become addicted to a drug. But in humans, the most vulnerable period is during the teen years. So if there are any things that you can do to protect your family, number one is try to keep your kids from doing drugs during their teen years. And we, in this culture, look at teen years as 13 through 19. But in terms of brain development, you still have a teenage brain up until you're about 22 to 25 years old. So that becomes very difficult. That becomes very difficult to control a offspring in our culture once they reach a certain age, especially beyond 18. The last area, which counts for about another 20% of whether a person becomes addicted, is the environment, where drugs are bought and sold or used, environments where there's a high incidence of violence, and environments where there is high threat stress. Worries about food, worries about housing, worries about personal safety is what defines a threat stress. Drug addictions and brain cells. Well, brain cells is what we call neurons. That is the technical name for a brain cell. And brain cell functions are programmed. Each cell has a specific job description, which we'll talk about shortly. But the DNA inside of that brain cell, it determines what the function of the brain cell is. Much like the software program that controls your computer operations, the DNA inside of your brain cells control your brain cell operations. And addictions are partly triggered by the DNA that sits inside of our brain cells. I know this is somewhat of a technical topic, but we need to cover the technical areas to give you some medical background. So when we talk about the broader areas on how the environment affects your DNA, you will have some basic understanding. So let's talk more in detail about this DNA, technically called deoxy-ribonucleic acid, DNA. DNA is made up of a long chain of chemicals that we call bases, but don't stress over the chemistry details. This is just informational. The main point is that the DNA is the carrier of genetic information from one generation to the next generation to the next generation. So proteins are an essential part of all living organisms. They keep the body functioning. And they include things like hormones and neurotransmitters. We'll talk more about neurotransmitters. When we don't have the right amount of these neurotransmitters, doctors call that a chemical imbalance. And that means your brain isn't working right. So you may be experiencing psychiatric problems like depression or bipolar disorder, or you might be experiencing drug addictions and alcohol addictions, which are also considered psychiatric disorders. Where is this DNA that I've been referring to, this deoxy-ribonucleic acid? Where is it? Well, I was hoping you'd ask that question. The location of the DNA is inside of your chromosomes. And if you look at this diagram on the left-hand side, it is a drawing of what a chromosome looks like. And if you look in the middle of the drawing, the blue part, the blue drawing, you'll see something that looks like a lot of spaghetti that is twisted around each other inside of that chromosome. And that twisted structure is your DNA that fits inside of your chromosomes. And your chromosomes are passed. One half from your mom is passed to you. One half from your dad is passed to you. And those two sets of chromosomes, they get together and decide which one has the most influence over you. If your mom had brown eyes and your dad had black eyes, which one will you get? And that's decided by the different chromosomes and the DNA, which one has priority over the other. The diagram on the right side is an electron microscope picture of an actual gene, actual chromosomes, and you see the representations inside the dark areas. Those would be your that would be your DNA and your genes. DNA and disease transmission. Genetic traits and diseases are passed along to us from our parents, grandparents, and ancestors through the DNA inside of our chromosomes. However, that is not the whole picture. That is half the picture, or maybe a little less than half the picture, but not the complete picture. So whether you develop an addiction is not totally dependent on your parents, grandparents, and ancestors through your DNA. Some depends on other factors, which we shall talk about, and environments that threatens your survival creates threat stress, a different kind of stress. We'll talk about the various types of stress, but in particular, I want you to know about threat stress. So the link is your DNA, the core of your very existence. It is dependent upon what was given to you from your parents or grandparents, and it is altered by things that happen to you in your environment. So the environment, which we'll come to understand, plays a significant role in the health and functioning of our DNA. And these environmental stress factors, what I call threat stress, can alter the DNA and not for the better. And it makes us more vulnerable to chronic diseases like opiate addictions. So when the opiate epidemic swept through neighborhoods and environment where threat stress existed, those individuals who have lived there for a significant period of time will have alterations in their DNA that makes them more vulnerable to the addiction. So how does living in a stressful environment affect the DNA? Well, it basically changes the shape of your chromosomes. And we showed you a picture of the chromosomes a few slides earlier, but it changes the shape of your DNA, which is housed inside of your chromosomes, and especially the end parts of the chromosome, which has a special name that I mentioned to you at the very beginning, that I wanted to introduce this term called telomeres. It's represented in the red part of this chromosome. Changes to the telomeres make us more susceptible to chronic diseases like high blood pressure or hypertension, or certain cancers and addictions like opiate addictions. Those changes also cause premature deaths, which you see more frequently in people who live all of their lives in high threat stress environments. So let's look a little closer at this telomere, shall we? Telomeres are structure, as I mentioned, at the end of the chromosome, and the name is derived from Greek. Telos means end, and meros means part. So a telomere would be the end part of a chromosome that is packed with your DNA. The concept of telomeres is relatively new. I started hearing about it in medical literature 5-6 years ago. However, the research started earlier than that. And if you look at the slide, you will see here are two PhD researchers that have led the field in the discovery and the functioning of telomeres. On the left is Dr. Elizabeth Blackburn, a PhD from University of California. She won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2009 for her research on telomeres. The other physician, Dr. Elissa Epel, also PhD, University of California, and professor of psychiatry. She studies telomeres in vulnerable populations, meaning people of color, people who have lived predominantly in these high threat stress environments. And we'll look closer to see how this chronic particular specified stress affects people that are vulnerable and in particular people of color. So telomeres, the normal functioning is to protect the DNA from harmful influences, both internal influences, things that happen within our body, and external influences, things that happen in our environment. When functioning correctly, telomeres can slow down the cell death, the neuron death, and your death. So we want good functioning telomeres. So telomeres, they get shorter every time a cell replicates or duplicates itself. And that cellular duplication is part of our existence. And so every time a cell duplicates or replicates, the telomere gets shorter. That is how we age. So you can tell a person's age by the length of their telomeres on the end of their chromosomes. But there are other things that can influence the shortening of the telomeres other than just normal aging. They're also shortened by internal stress chemicals. So when we're stressed, our bodies release stress chemicals. One is a chemical called cortisol. Another is a chemical called insulin. And this is response to things that happen in our external environment. So I just want to point out that there are some acute stressors and there are chronic stressors. Acute stressors and internal changes in our stress chemicals would be normal and it would increase our chance for survival. So for instance, if we were walking through the landscape and we heard the roar of a lion, well, that would get your attention. It would increase your anxiety, it would increase your stress, and those internal chemicals would force you to be more alert so that you can protect yourself from the roar from the lion. But that should be a rare incident. That should not be a daily incident. However, if you live in an environment where the lions were there, 7 days a week, and you are constantly under stress for your survival, that is chronic stress. That is threat stress. That is different from an acute stress that will increase your arousal, your awareness, and your performance. Eventually, telomeres get too short to do their job. So whether that is from the normal aging process or whether that is from the external stressors that we encounter in our environment, once they get too short to do their job, the DNA held inside starts to spill out and unravel. Not good. And that causes our cells to age and die, which causes us to age and die. So in other words, this is how premature aging from stress can kill you. It destroys your telomeres. So if we look at telomeres and environmental stressors, and there's certain lifestyle habits that we may adopt that may be healthy or unhealthy, but environmental stressors can accelerate the shortening of your telomeres and at the same time shorten your life expectancy. So if we look at this diagram, on my left, not sure if that's your left or right, but on my left you can see that the telomeres start out normal at the top, and over time they get shorter and shorter until they completely disappear. And when they completely disappear, that cell is at risk of dying. On the right hand side, my right, not sure for sure right or left, but you see 4 different telomeres, all of the exact same size. So these telomeres have had protective factors. So they stay healthy looking, and that cell stays intact for a lengthy period of time. And so there are things that we can do to protect ourselves and protect our telomeres, which we will look at in detail. So let's review the link between the environment and addictions. This is a big topic that I want to hammer this point. There is a link between the environment that you live in and your probabilities of developing an addiction. And that is the link. Stress. The big link between the environment and addictions is stress. And if you look at these, at the picture in the center, these are people who have been stressed. They are responding to stressful environment, stressful politics that exists in our country today. But I mentioned previously, there are 2 different types of stress. There is the performance stress, which is associated with our work or some type of task performance. If you had to, if you are an artist or musician and you are about to perform in front of a large audience, there may be a certain amount of performance stress associated with that event. Or if you're at work and you have a new job description or something's been added to your job description, that may be associated with increased performance stress, but that performance stress is usually acute. It means it hits suddenly, but then it's time limited. We know when it will end. In the case of the artist performing, it will end at the end of the concert. In the case of the new item added to your job description, it will end when you master that new skill set to do that job, or you end up getting a new manager. I don't like using the word boss, but you know what I mean. On the other hand, threat stress is associated with your environment, not necessarily your work, it's not necessarily task performance, it's your environment, and it poses a threat to life, your life. It tends to be chronic and never ending unless we escape the environment. Threat stress includes things like food insecurity, constantly worrying about how you're going to provide 3 meals a day for your kids, for yourself and your kids, or having to skip a meal yourself to provide food for your kids. Housing insecurity, where you don't know whether you're going to be evicted or whether you have enough money to meet the monthly rent or mortgage. Next is educational insecurity. Education is a big part of success in America. There are only about 3 ways to be successful outside of education. One, if you have a serious athletic talent. 2, if you have a serious artistic talent. And 3, if you have a serious entrepreneurial talent. If you can sell ice cream in Alaska, you can probably be very financially successful in America. If you don't have those extreme talents, then your next option, legal options we're talking, is education. And the quality of education makes all the difference. So if you're in an environment where you don't have quality education, then you suffer from education insecurity. And the last part of threat stress is risk of personal violence. You'll see a little more in the next couple of slides. So the sources of stress can be both internal and external. When you have external stresses, your body will overproduce cortisol, which causes hypertension. And when I say hypertension, you think cardiac events like heart attacks, you think kidney failure, and you think strokes. Those are the end results of high blood pressure untreated. The overproduction of insulin is the beginning of diabetes. It may start with prediabetes and end up in full-blown diabetes. Both of these chemicals are in response to external stressors. The external factors include certain foods, especially foods that causes obesity. These foods will degrade our telomeres. Excessive drink of alcohol, we'll see in a moment, and environmental stress, which we mentioned in the previous slide. Food, housing, educational security, and worries about personal safety, and witness, either direct witness or indirect witness to violence to your friends or family members or neighbors. Making the case. Let's talk about the facts. I think we've already established the fact that living in a high-stress environment contributes to the higher rates of chronic diseases like opiate addictions, like hypertension, like cancer, and a lot of other chronic disease. Fact number 2 is that the majority of people of color live in these high-stress neighborhoods, along with some poor white people live in the same kinds of neighborhoods and suffer from the same risks. But in terms of people of color, African Americans and Latinx Americans, let's look at how this happened. Was this by chance, or whether, or was this on purpose? So as I make my case, many of my data points in making this case is from this book, The Hidden Cost of Being African American: How Wealth Perpetuates Inequality by Thomas M. Shapiro. And I'd like to mention that one of my patients, who is a Ivy League educated lawyer, recommended this book to me, and he happens to be Caucasian. And this was part of his required reading during his law studies, so that he could understand the difficulties of clients that may be African American. So one area I like to talk about is residential segregation. In other words, where you live, being segregated based on how much money you make, economics, or segregated in terms of the color of your skin, Uh, Residential segregation by economics and race is the principal reason that we have unequal education. I'd also like to mention that school funding, which has been um, studied by the Ohio legislature, and still no equitable solution has been passed in terms of legislation. We have unequal funding for schools because it's partly based on the tax, for the housing. So if you live in a very um, high up income neighborhood, you pay more taxes on those houses, and the school system gets more taxes for the schools. If you live in a under performing neighborhood where the housing costs are much lower, there's much less taxes, much less county taxes that are collected that will go into that local school system. And this is how education is unequal in America. When we look at home ownership, which I just talked about, according to Thomas M. Shapiro, he says that determining home ownership, where you live, or either whether you even own a home or whether you're renting, it determines the quality of education of the children. So big part if you're in a high stress environment and you have desires to move forward, one of the things that helps you elevate your game is home ownership. Home ownership determines the quality of education of your children. You may remember some time ago there was an African American woman who lived on the border of one neighborhood to bordering another neighborhood. And the other neighborhood was a suburban school district that had a much higher performing school than the one that she lived in. And so she made arrangements to get her kid across the line into the high performing school district. And they found out about it. And they charged her with a crime. And they sent her to prison for seeking out educational resources that they said she was not entitled to because she didn't live in that neighborhood. I want to talk more about that as we move forward. Residential segregation, slide 3. The quality of education determines if you can escape the socioeconomic barriers and high stress environments that you were born into. That comes from Dr. Alvin Felt. So I know a lot about that. I've experienced a lot about that. If you look at this picture, you see this African American woman, young woman sitting in a classroom with predominantly Caucasian people, and reading in between the lines, she's there, but I question how much she's accepted on being there. But she did make it there. That's an important piece. So how it happened? Still making my case. The United States government sponsored economic inequality. Starting back in 1862, there was something called the Homestead Act. So when we say 1862, you're thinking Abraham Lincoln, you're thinking somewhere in that time period slavery ended, and the Homestead Act gave Americans that were willing to move to the Midwest and the West, it gave them up to 160 acres of public land to live on for a small registration fee. In fact, there are 14 million descendants of these homestead people that are still living today. People that receive that Homestead Act receive close to what I will call free land back in the 1800s that is passed along from one generation to the next generation to the next generation. And so now they may have several hundreds of acres of land that they own and manage and they're descendants of the people who received the homestead acres back in the 1800s. The second U.S. government-sponsored economic inequality was the 1944 GI Bill. And that was at the end of World War II. Many of the veterans were returning home, and that GI Bill allowed them to go to college. It paid for their college education. Imagine that. Free. And it gave them low down payments on their mortgage and low interest rates on their mortgage. So that is definitely a hand up. The problem is that these policies were essentially excluded from African Americans and other people of color. They were reserved for the white majority. To give you a perspective on what 1 acre of land looks like, think of a football field minus the end zones. So in this particular case, you see they have enough on this 1 acre for a little house, maybe a barn. They got enough for the cows, the pigs, the chickens, and the crops. That's 1 acre of land. Imagine if someone gave you 160 of these. How much wealth would you pass along to your second or third generation over time? How it happened? Well, there was institutional racism that created economic inequality. One policy in particular is called redlining by the banks, which was a systematic way to deny mortgages to people of color based on their color, not based on their individual qualifications. So there were certain neighborhoods you were not allowed to move into. And guess what? A lot of those neighborhoods had the high-performing schools. And this activity by the banks, by one of the major institutions in this country, was legal up until 1968. To give you perspective, I was born in 1956, and institutional racism was legal. It was legal during the early part of my childhood. It was legal up until the Fair Housing Act was passed, which was part of the Civil Rights Act of 1968 that Martin Luther King and others marched and suffered for us to have a better shot at equality in this country that in a lot of ways perpetrated economic inequality. So the uncomfortable truth is where you were born and who you're born to determines a lot about your success in America, because the decks were stacked against certain people, in particular people of color. And to bridge that gap, we can't bridge that gap until we deal with the discomfort that comes from the uncomfortable truth. And the truth is that a large segment of American society had a 155-year head start, an advantage that we're not even including the 200 years of slavery. So about 155 years ago, 2 lifespans, people had a head start from the U.S. government policies, from the major institutional policies that kept people of color behind. So we had a late start in the race. Slavery did not end until 1865. African Americans and Latino Americans, or Latinx, the political correct term, the majority of us are forced to live in stressful, threatening environments that trigger addictions. That's part of the ugly truth. The other part of the ugly truth is that this is due to century-old policies of racial segregation, economic segregation, and educational segregation, while the current white majority to this day still reserves these resources for themselves. And this is perpetrated generation after generation, and at the same time, it makes us more vulnerable to chronic diseases that destroys our telomeres, that spills our DNA out, that kills our brain cells and our body cells, and causes us premature death. So the link to environment and addictions. Environmental stress, what I call threat stress, or in particular what Dr. Apel, the PhD researcher on telomeres, what she calls threat stress. We're borrowing her term that she coined. This threat stress impairs our brain function. One might say, is this a chemical imbalance? Well, if it affects your neurotransmitters, one could argue that point. But it reduces our ability to resist impulses. And anybody that's worked in addiction treatment, worked with people with addictions, there's a thing called triggers. They could be calm and restful at one point, not thinking about anything stressful, but a sight, sound, smell will trigger them to want to use drugs. So this environmental stress, threat stress, impairs our brain functions that makes us more responsive to triggers in the environment. It also increases our brain response to rewards, which means if we do a drug or alcohol, we can pick it up, but now we can't put it down. So that factor, that the more responsive brain predisposes us to addictions. And it makes us crave more. So if you get exposed to a drug or alcohol and you like it, and you have a craving for more, essentially that makes that drug or that drink more addictive to you. Fighting back. Fighting back to save our telomeres and save our lives. I like to connect those 2 points. Our lives are the big picture, but the telomeres are the small submicroscopic areas that you can't see inside of your cells, inside of your chromosomes that house your DNA. There are things we have to do to fight back. Many of us did not receive the birth blessing. The birth blessing of being born into a family that had resources, into a neighborhood that had college prep schools. Many of us did not receive that birth blessing. Let's focus on number 1, get out. Getting out of a toxic environment is easier said than done. Remember, there were centuries of government and institutional policies to put you there and to keep you there. So obviously getting out is more than just a decision. You got to have a plan, and probably a long-term plan. It's going to take a while. So in order to get out, first of all, you need to talk to people that made it out. Where do you have this conversation at is a topic for further discussion, but we need to put together some interfaces where people that got out can talk to people who haven't got out, and we can share ideas and perhaps resources. The other thing is to team up with a like-minded partner. So if you have a partner who's okay and staying in the environment and you're wanting to get out, I would say you're unequally yoked. Be better for you to choose a mate that is on the same page. If both people are okay with putting together a long-term plan, it's going to be easier with a like-minded partner. Lastly is look for organizations that have a mission to help you and your family get out. I had some help getting out. There were some things that happened to me in my life. There were some people, there were some institutions, there were some organizations that gave me a helping hand, and I was able to use that help to get out. So going back to number 2, learning how to save. This is a really big thing. I don't care how much, because learning how to save doesn't require $200 a check. It doesn't require that. It requires as little as $10 a check. You have to learn the process of saving, of having and not spending, because it will take resources to get out. And it's easier to save when you got a plan versus living and spending for the moment. So what I'm talking about basically is the difference between short-term and long-term. Between immediate gratification, I get paid today and I'm buying me something today, immediate gratification, versus delayed gratification. Yes, I got paid today, but I'm gonna put this money back so that I can get something that I really want or need down the road. It's going to take me several paychecks to get it, but I'm willing to delay gratification to down the road to have enough money put back to get it. Delayed gratification. Part of your escape plan to get out. What if you can't get out right now? Well, number 3, go for the low-hanging fruit. And what I mean by that is that if you can't change your environment, your toxic environment, change the effect that the environment has over you. There are things you can do. Even if you're planning to get out, there are things that you can do while you're planning to get out, like changing your eating habits, protect your telomeres, changing your drinking habits to protect your telomeres, changing your smoking habits to protect your telomeres, change your exercise habits to protect your telomeres, and master the art of mindfulness. Each one of these changes will increase the length of your telomeres and at the same time increase your life expectancy. Nothing happens, nothing good happens without change. What about the foods? There are certain foods that will increase the length of your telomeres, that will protect your DNA housed inside of your chromosomes, that will expand your life expectancy. There are certain foods associated with increasing the length of your telomeres. One is beans. Cheap resource of beans. Who knew? Who knew that beans, low cost, would be a protective factor? The others are nuts and fruits. You've heard those mentioned in several recommendations for healthy living. Instead of potato chips and dip, nuts and fruit. A surprise to me, I'm probably doing good on this one, is coffee. I drink coffee every day, so I'm good on that. The last few items are 100% fruit juice, no sugar added, dairy products. I have other issues that prevent me from eating dairy products, and seaweed, which is common in the Asian culture, but not so common in the American culture. I will have to experiment with seaweed, okay? Hopefully it tastes like collard greens, hopefully. Here are some examples of some healthy choices that I use. This dish is called gallo pinto. I discovered this dish by reading National Geographic Foods to Live By back in December 2019. And this dish is from the Blue Zones, and particularly the Blue Zone in Costa Rica. So there are blue zones. There's at least one blue zone in the the U.S., and that is in the San Diego area, a religious sect of people who don't eat meat are blue zone communities, and blue zones are people who typically live to be 100+ years old. This particular dish is a meatless dish from the Blue Zone in Costa Rica, and I replace it with a typical breakfast that allows me to avoid the red meat, bacon, sausage, and ham, which you will see in the next 2 slides is a thing that will shorten your telomeres. So the recipe is in the tip sheet. Another healthy choice is Brunswick stew, a southern dish from my home state of Georgia. It contains 7 servings of vegetable in one dish, along with pulled chicken or beef. And I must say, it is awesome with some cornbread. Okay, that is also in the tip sheet. Now let's talk about the bad foods, the foods that will accelerate the shortening of your telomeres, which means will accelerate the cell death, your brain cells and your body cells, and will shorten your death. All you've got to do is keep eating them. The first, alcohol in excess. Second is red meat, namely beef and pork. Is usually the red meats that we consume in this country. And processed meats. And this was kind of a downer because that is the hot dogs, the sausage, and the lunch meat, which is very common in our fast-paced American society, especially if you are income challenged. Or you're time challenged, grabbing a hot dog, grabbing a sandwich is what we do a lot during lunch. Some people don't know what excessive drinking is or is not, so I'm going to define it. As you know, I'm a psychiatrist. You may not know that I'm an addiction certified psychiatrist. So according to the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, excessive drinking is when we start binge drinking. So if you're a woman, if you knock down 4 drinks a day, you are excessively drinking. If you're a man and you knock down 5 drinks in a day, you're excessively drinking. And for those that don't know, a standard drink includes the following: 1 12-ounce beer. I did not say malt liquor. 1 12-ounce beer, 5 ounces of wine, and 1 shot of liquor. All of those has the exact same amount of alcohol, about 14 grams of alcohol for each standard drink. And now you have some good measurements. However, moderate drinking or not excessive drinking would be considered 1 drink a day if you're a woman, 1 drink or less. If you're a man, 2 drinks per day or less than 2 drinks, 2 standard drinks per day. And remember, a standard drink is 1 12-ounce beer, 1 5-ounce glass of wine, which you see is a little less than half full in that glass, and 1.5 ounces or 1 shot of alcohol. That is a standard drink. Exercise should be a major part of our stress management and our coping skills. I don't live in a high stress environment anymore, but I work in a high stress environment. So my day job tends to be very stressful, and one of my major stress management tools is exercise. It's good both mentally and physically, and now I'm happy to learn that it's good for my telomeres as well. So according to Dr. Timothy Miller, orthopedic and sports medicine doc at OSU, I saw his article in webmd.com. He said that exercise is medicine. Think of exercise as medicine. And why not? Now that we know that exercise will expand the length of your telomeres, which protects your DNA. It's the end part of your chromosomes. It will expand your life expectancy. It will help lower the negative effects of toxic neighborhood stress. So why not think of exercise as medicine? Take your medicine on a regular basis. I would say that. He recommends weight-bearing exercises like walking, running, stair climbing, and light weightlifting, things that stress your muscles and stress your tendons, also increase the strength of your bones. He also recommends quit smoking, which is one of the biggest risk factors for bone loss, osteoporosis, slip and fall, where you break a hip bone or arm or leg bone, those sorts of things. Exercise is medicine. Another part of exercise, what I'm noticing, I live in the downtown area, not too far from this scene that you see here on the Scioto Mile, right downtown Columbus. I see a lot of people that drive and walk. They may not live downtown, but they drive downtown and they get out and walk. They walk dogs, they walk the kids, and I recommend doing this about 4 times a week. What's good about this particular location is that it is relatively safe, and there are a lot of trails. So you can take the city trail, where what I call the city trail, where you can walk along this stretch of the Scioto Mile, and you will see the city landscape. You'll see the buildings. It is always immaculately manicured. It's just a very tranquil area. Um, but they also have trails that go up into the woods where you see no buildings at all. It is all nature. You see wildlife, you see ducks, you see cranes, you see hawks flying up above. Very tranquil. And I'm recommending that you pound this pavement or these trails at least 4 times a week. Make that part of your regular stress management. But there are other things that will protect our telomeres. Remember, we're talking about going for the low-hanging fruit, and that is the concept of mindfulness. And mindfulness, to be very general, is a inward mental focus, moving away from what's going on in the world and focusing on what's going on internally and blocking out the external world at least for a few minutes. That is the general concept of mindfulness, focusing on what's going on internally with you at the moment. Let's look at some examples of mindfulness. Prayer, meditation, yoga, certain types of therapy or counseling. Another technique called guided imagery relaxation. Another one is ear acupuncture, which I am trained to do ear acupuncture. And mentally focused exercises, like if you're doing a bench press, as you lay down there and focus on your breathing and prepare your mind to lift that heavy weight. All of those examples are examples of mindfulness. Tuning out the external, focusing in on the internal. The two it highlights that are big parts for me is prayer and yoga. So if you think about it, prayer is essentially pushing out much of the external and focusing in on you and your higher power. And yoga in the US form is not so much the 1960s Beatles, Beach Boys yoga. It is more of a physical type of exercise with stretching and holding certain poses for X amount of time. That's what yoga, the American version, is. Very healthy, and now we know that it is also part of what um, extends the length of our telomeres. This is called gentle yoga. Some people might call it beginning yoga, where you have a soft mat and you move your body in a gentle, comfortable way, but it encourages movement without straining. And you hold those poses for about 5 minutes, which allows you time to think internal. You can use pillows or cushions for comfort if you have uh, issues like arthritis of the knees or the hips, but it makes it uncomfortable for you to get in the position that you see in the picture. But it's also good for some of the common ailments that we have, people with back pain and neck pain, which are typical sources of body stress. When you're in a stressful external environment, that external stress transmits inside of your body. We talked about how it would increase the stress chemicals, increase the cortisol, increase the insulin, but it also affects our musculoskeletal and our nervous system. So you will experience more chronic pains, especially back pains and neck pains, when you're under a lot of stress. So the recommendation would be to read, learn, and experience as much as you can uh, about mindfulness. You'll hear this term more and more. It's becoming a bigger part of counseling and therapy. So if you ever decide to go to counseling or therapy, your therapist or your counselor may recommend some mindfulness exercises for you. Also, if you have an active addiction and you're going to a drug and alcohol treatment, a lot of treatment programs are now using mindfulness as a way to help you increase the success of your recovery from drug addictions. And so these things restores the DNA stability, meaning the structure of our telomeres, the end parts, and can protect us at the same time. So this brings us to the end of this presentation, the end of this encounter. I want you to be sure that you contact MACC to get your tip sheet so that you can start protecting yourself against these threat stress that may be part of your environment. Again, this is Dr. Alvin Pelt, the medical director of the Pelt Clinic, and I want to thank you for your time and attention.